All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is my real pleasure to welcome you to LSE and to GRI in particular for this online event. My name is Marion Dumas, and I am an Assistant Professorial Research Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science at the Grantham Research Institute. In our discussion today, we will focus on the challenge of a locally just net zero transition in the UK for workers, industries, local and regional economies. So in this discussion today, we'll leave aside the impact on consumers and really focus on communities. The challenges ahead in the UK are multiple, not just the energy industry and replacing the value to local economies of oil and gas, in particular in the North Sea, but also how to develop manufacturing capacity for renewable energy, how to decarbonize manufacturing without leading to offshoring, transitioning gas boiler installers and maintenance workers to renewable sources of heat, changes on the supply side of the transport sector, such as manufacturing of auto components, demand for that declining, upskilling of motor services, need for extension services for farmers and land managers. They are across multiple sectors and multiple geographies. We have a constellation of challenges to face, but we also have a lot of hope coming from the potential for well-planned and procedurally inclusive transition processes that will hopefully go about this in a much better way than the sort of reactive regeneration policies we had following mine closures, for example, in the 80s. So to speak about this, our speakers, I'm very happy to welcome our speakers, Andy Pike, Charlotte Hartley, Andy Gouldson, and Linda Clarke, whom I will introduce when it is their turn to speak. And they will start each by presenting their own conception of what a just transition is and insights from the sectors they're familiar with and the geographies they're familiar with about concrete ways of furthering those objectives. I will then ask myself a few questions to our panel to start the discussion. And of course, you will have much opportunity then to engage in the Q&A through the chat. You will be able to put in your question, upvote each other's questions. And it would be fantastic if you could include your name and affiliation. That allows us to make sure that a wide range of stakeholders' perspectives are represented in the Q&A, which is going to be the most interesting part of this event, of course. For those Twitter users in the audience, the hashtag for today's event is that's just net zero. And this online event is being recorded and will be made available as a podcast unless major technical difficulties occur. Yes, so I think without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, who is Andy Pike, the Sir Henry Day's Chair of Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University. Andy's research focuses on how regions and localities can govern their economic development in an international context while aiming for social and ecological progress. His work has shed light on structural change and adaptation in British cities, the impact of financialization on local infrastructure, and the manufacturing renaissance in industrial regions and local industrial policy. So Andy will help set the scene, the stage for our discussion today. The floor is yours, Andy.
Okay, thanks very much, Marion, and to all the participants and other speakers, and thanks for the invitation to contribute to this important and timely session. I want to make 3 points, really. First, I think it's critical that we have a geographically sensitive approach to considering just transition at the local level. I think our diagnosis of the challenges and impacts involved are very geographically differentiated. They affect people and places in different kinds of ways across the piece. And I think a geographical understanding is very important in terms of underpinning more of a kind of place-based, decentralized, rather than a very national and centralized approach to the challenges involved. So that's the first point I wanted to make. The second one, I think it's absolutely critical as well in thinking about these issues that we think about a broader than only economic set of concerns. And clearly it's really important to better address the social, environmental dimensions of just transition locally. Now, of course, this is fundamental bread and butter stuff for those interested in sustainability. They're the building blocks of sustainability thinking, but these are really important to work through, I think, in terms of the kinds of accommodations and balances. And I use those words rather than the kind of zero-sum type economist trade-off way of thinking between economic, social, and environmental issues that we're going to have to try and juggle in terms of this locally just transition. And I think these have always been, certainly in our work, balancing economic, social, and environmental dimensions have always been integral to notions of local development, however these are defined locally. But for example, if we're looking at developing new and greener jobs in growing sectors to help the transition of workers out of higher carbon sectors, for example, then it's crucial that we don't lose sight of fundamental things about job quality, autonomy, pay, progression, terms and conditions, kind of things I think Linda might be talking about in terms of the construction sector a little bit later. But these are fundamental things that we need to try and juggle at the same time as thinking about the development of new sectors and greener sectors. And I think as well on this point of linking economic and social and environmental dimensions is the pandemic, amongst many things, has really underlined the importance of both economic and social infrastructures, and particularly the importance of health, care and well-being. And it's interesting to see now that discussions around recovery and stimulus investment, particularly in the States, and President Biden's proposed $2 trillion infrastructure package is actually including elements of social and care and childcare as part of its investment. So it's very important that it's becoming quite pressing in terms of thinking through how we go beyond just slogans like levelling up and building back better to actually put some concrete substance into what exactly a fairer, cleaner and greener future looks like then at the local level. So that's the second point, better connecting and balancing economic, social, environmental conditions. And the third and last one is, I think it's very important that we recognise that locally just transition needs very supportive national frameworks and commitments, as well as these appropriately decentralised powers and resources. So I think it's only through having both of these things that we can build capacity and tailor institutional arrangements and packages of policy instruments then to local circumstances. So again, to address this geographically differentiated challenge of locally just transition. Now we're seeing this, of course, in some countries with national goals for net zero carbon, which set the overall framework and direction for policy at the national level. But certainly in England, the other part of it in the UK context is really more problematic. We have a patchwork of governance within England at the subnational level, which is struggling, I think, in many ways to try and effect just transition, despite national government's commitment to levelling up. There's been a kind of centralisation, I think, in the kind of post-Brexit pandemic period, then movement towards a whole series of more competition-based, nationally determined funds with relatively limited resources. So things like the Levelling Up Funds, UK Community Renewal Funds, Community Ownership Funds, Shared Prosperity Fund, the replacement for EU structural funds. They've all got these characteristics, it seems, within them. And crucially as well, we have the ongoing kind of challenge that our subnational funding and financing system within England remains very highly centralised. And while it retains some important elements of redistribution from richer to poorer areas, it serves to constrain the kind of fiscal space, if you like, at the local level for innovative funding and financing arrangements to actually progress a locally just transition. And I know Charlotte and Andy will be talking much more about what's happening in Scotland and Yorkshire and Humber about the ways in which local actors have been attempting to tackle these kinds of concerns. And certainly within England, there are some interesting innovations amongst local authorities at the local level. Hackney, London Borough has been trying to divest from fossil fuels as part of its pension investments. We've got developments towards what's called a green city deal over in Liverpool City. We've got hypothecated local taxes then in district councils like Warwick, and also the issuing of climate change bonds then over in West Berkshire Council. So there's lots of innovations at the local level that are possible, and perhaps it's the kind of growing and scaling up of these types of things that are important. So in a nutshell, three things then just to contribute to this just transition locally discussion today: a geographically sensitive approach, relating and balancing the economic, social, environmental dimensions more closely together, and trying to marry up these supportive national frameworks with appropriately decentralised powers and resources. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to your questions and discussion. Thanks, Marion.
Great, thank you, Andy. Now I will yield the floor to Charlotte Hartley, who is a member of the Scottish Just Transition Commission, although I mean the Transition Commission has published its final report, so I don't exactly know what are the continuing activities, but was a key member of this, and is trustee of the 2050 Climate Group and Engagement Strategist at Pale Blue Dot, which is a very innovative company developing hydrogen and carbon capture projects in the UK. Has a wide range of experience in different aspects of making this transition happen.
Thank you, Marion. Yes, I wear a lot of hats. I just want to use the next couple of minutes to reflect on my own experience. I work in industry. My day job, as Marion mentioned, is for a carbon capture and storage and hydrogen project developer. And through my role with 2050 Climate Group, I've been fortunate to be representing Scotland's youth on the Scottish Government's Just Transition Commission and the UK-wide Environmental Justice Commission, which is being run through the Institute for Public Policy Research. So quite a broad-ranging set of experiences. And what we've really, I guess where I would start is probably from my industrial background. I live in Aberdeen, where of course is the hub of North Sea oil and gas activity. And what we are seeing now is a big shift from the message that Aberdeen is the oil and gas capital of Europe to trying to rebrand to be the energy capital of Europe, and seeing how the messaging around the ambition and the reaction, I think, to the social movement around climate change is kind of cascading into the actual companies and, more importantly, the people who work for these companies. And in some respects, in some instances, we're seeing people who are really committed and engaged and enthusiastic about the transition to a net zero economy. And in other aspects, in other instances, there is arguably a sense of ignorance about the scale of the transition that is coming. So through the work of the Just Transition Commission, we have met over 2 years all across Scotland, including in Aberdeen, and looking at the oil and gas industry. And we actually did look at, it was interesting to hear Andy Pike's perspective around looking at just transition through lenses other than solely economic, because the Just Transition Commission for Scottish Government did view it very much through the economic lens and through the jobs lens. And how does the transition for Scotland, what does it look like for people's work? We had 2 trade union representatives on the commission. I was particularly interested in how the youth were participated in the process of just transition in Scotland, and where lifelong learning was built into processes, built into planning. Opito in 2019 produced a skills report for the skills that the oil and gas industry would need in the future. And of course, that was of big significance in this region, because so many people are either directly or indirectly employed by the industry. And what we found that the industry needs to attract 25,000 new people into the industry, and 4,500 of those roles don't exist yet. Opito analysed that they are likely to be in data science and in kind of new technology development, but the rest is unknown. It's similar perhaps to the role of an influencer was unknown a few years ago, and now a lot of people in the UK economy kind of identify that as their profession. And it also identified that 28% of people's time is currently spent on repetitive and automated tasks, which are likely to be replaced by machinery. And how do we best reskill and redeploy people into equivalent, high earning, high skilled and engaging jobs? So there's a lot of activity happening up in this region around it. The project that I work for, this is not intended to be a sales pitch for carbon capture and storage and hydrogen, but the Scottish cluster of industrial projects, and Andy Gouldson, who is going to be speaking about another cluster of activity in the UK, speaking about how we create this like blueprint for industrial decarbonisation in the UK, building on the existing skills base that we have in the UK for major infrastructure work, major infrastructure development, and projects building on our existing knowledge. Quite frankly, using the capital that we have here to decarbonise and then to transfer and export that knowledge and expertise around the world. And finally, I'm going to draw my opening contribution to a close here. Earlier today, I was at an event with the Environmental Justice Commission launching the Aberdeenshire Climate and Fairness report. So the Environmental Justice Commission had citizens' juries around the UK, and this was the Aberdeenshire one. And one of the statements that came through the report that I would like to share with you all is, to bring people with us on this journey, we need to see this not as a sacrifice, but as a progression to a more sustainable way of life. We need to be positive in our response to these emergencies. So, Marion, I will stop there.
Great, thank you very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Andy Gouldson, who is Professor of Environmental Policy at the University of Leeds. His research is very much impact-oriented and focuses on promoting low carbon and climate resilient development at the local and regional scales. Andy is an expert at building bridges between disciplines and between academia and policymaking. So he is one of the founders and leads of the ESRC Place-Based Climate Action Network, PCAN, and he's one of the founders and chairs of the Leeds Climate Commission. So Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here, and great to see Just Transitions, lodged on the agenda and, getting the prominence it needs. So I am director of something called the Yorkshire and Humber Climate Commission, which is part of the PCAN network that Marion just described, which is a joint initiative between LSE and Leeds, and also Edinburgh and Belfast. And the Yorkshire and Humber Commission is an attempt to bring together all of the key actors in the region to have a discussion and to guide and track action on climate change at a regional scale. And Just Transitions is a key priority for the Commission for good reason, and I'll go into why it's such an issue here in Yorkshire. The first key point, and Marion alluded to it in her introduction earlier, is that Yorkshire and many other areas in the north of England and also in South Wales know all too well what an unjust energy transition feels like, from the 80s and the rather brutal attack on coal, which from a climate perspective may have been a good thing, but from a social and economic perspective was absolutely devastating for many regions. And it was done in a, I think, largely unplanned and unmanaged way, and the lack of justice around that still runs deep in many areas of the UK. And the last thing I think that many of us environmentalists want to do is to repeat any aspects of that as we're driving a further low carbon transition. And here in Yorkshire, especially in East Yorkshire, we have huge clusters of high carbon industries and critical infrastructure and some key cities and some clean natural areas, which are massively at risk from the climate transition. And much as people like me have projected about the benefits of the transition to net zero and talked about all the job creation possibilities and the opportunities to improve public health and tackle fuel poverty and so on and so on, I think we have to acknowledge, and honestly I think we've been too late to acknowledge the downsides of the transition for some key people and some key areas and some key sectors. And unless we do that, then we do risk driving through an unjust transition, but perhaps more pertinently, we also risk the transition being stopped in its tracks through social opposition. And you know, the Gilets jaunes movement in France is a good example of that, that is often cited here. So East Yorkshire broadly is a region. 25% of UK trade comes up the Humber. The largest cluster of carbon intensive industries is on the banks of the Humber. Something like 16% of UK electricity is generated on land in the Yorkshire and Humber region. We also have enormous investments in offshore wind at the moment. And broadly, we've seen those investments, meaning that we shut down our coal-fired power stations in the last 15 years. And that transition's happened in a quite a stealthy and invisible way. But I think that can't carry on forever as we get towards net zero and the ambitions become, you know, more obvious, and it becomes less possible to pursue that in a stealthy way. Then these justice dimensions are going to really come to the fore if they haven't already. So East Yorkshire has huge flood risk areas. The city of Hull, cities or towns of Goole and Doncaster and so on are flooded really regularly. We have 1 in 100-year floods happening every 3 or 4 years in some of those areas. You know, the impacts are very real. And there is a risk that, you know, people will move out of some key cities unless they're more effectively protected. That critical infrastructure will be put at risk. That there will be a lack of inward investment into areas which are susceptible to flood risk. That our natural and cultural heritage will be put at risk as well. So that's one key element of a vicious circle of climate change. But the other is the high carbon industrial sectors. And, you know, they're obviously relying heavily on the net part of net zero, because honestly, I think it's really challenging to think how sectors like steel and concrete and glass can make the transition to fully zero. There has to be some net element. And here in Yorkshire, I think there's a lot of faith being put in carbon capture and storage. Frankly, you know, the government have divvied over this for more than a decade. Had the government got behind it 10 or more years ago, when I think they should have done, then we could have been a long way down this transition already. We have a steel plant in Scunthorpe, it's on the north, in North Lincolnshire rather than in Yorkshire, which is at risk, and thousands of jobs are at risk in that steel plant and in associated supply chains. And the same thing seems to be happening as with the coal industry. Really not much activity going into reinvesting and regenerating those areas and protecting the livelihoods of those communities. And then we're surprised that those people and those sectors and the unions that are associated with them are skeptical about climate change, because, you know, whatever they think about the science, they're more concerned about their day-to-day well-being and realities. And, you know, that skepticism is there, and we need to acknowledge that and deal with it positively and proactively. Across Yorkshire as a whole, actually, the New Economics Foundation have just published a report today which suggests that 15% of jobs in the region are in high carbon sectors and are at risk from net zero targets. Our own analysis suggested it was a little bit lower, perhaps 11%, but that still means 350,000 jobs at risk because of climate change and climate change legislation and net zero commitments. So what do we do about that? You know, if we do nothing, then that vicious circle we were talking about with resilience is compounded by another vicious circle around net zero. So we see, you know, the prospect of job losses, lack of inward investment, industrial flight, even population flight, you know, because of flooding and net zero targets. What a horrible future to contend or to predict for a region. How do we turn that into a virtuous circle instead? And this, to me, is the heart of the just transition argument. There are two things that I think that need to be done, and that the Yorkshire Commission I direct is trying to lead on. One is around climate resilience, and there is a massive need to unlock investment in climate resilience and risk reduction, and to do that in an equitable way that isn't just based on house prices or values at risk, as has been the case in UK policy, but is driven by equity. You know, what do you do about a city like Hull? Do you just say, no, we're not going to invest, and the investments will be into the billions in radical flood protection measures, you know, or do you just basically say, we can't do this, and have a policy of managed retreat for a major city, you know, to me, that is not a defendable position. One of the good things that's been happening is a innovation in green infrastructure and in nature-based solutions that have been massively effective, much lower carbon as well as more climate resilient, but also much more popular, and they deal with the biodiversity crisis as well and public health and so on. They've been really, really impactful in protecting Hull in the last couple of years. So there are opportunities, but nonetheless, we still need much more strategic level investment in climate resilience. On the net zero side, then, you know, we face huge challenges, and there are upsides. So Hull as a city has seen 10,000 or more jobs created for the offshore wind sector, which is a big benefit for the city. But, you know, there are other high carbon sectors around there which don't have that kind of opportunity. And for me personally, I know that there are issues with it, and we should be, you know, aware of the downsides as well as the upsides. But I think carbon capture and storage in an area like Yorkshire, where you have such a cluster of high carbon sectors, very close to offshore gas fields, which could be used for carbon storage, they ought to be a case for a massive pilot to demonstrate the value of CCS. Beyond that, and just to start to sum up, I think that we need to stimulate new forms of investment. And where we do stimulate investment, we need to channel it towards the areas and the sectors and the communities and the people who will suffer the downsides of transition otherwise. We need to, you know, channel the upsides towards the areas which will feel the downsides most acutely. And that means having a spatial approach. I think that goes back to what Andy was saying earlier. We need to have maps of communities at risk and sectors at risk. We need to facilitate industrial development in those kind of zones. And CCS could be a massive magnet for inward investment for industries which will struggle to meet net zero targets unless they have access to a CCS infrastructure. So that is a key kind of cornerstone investment. But there are multiple others that are going on at the moment. And as Andy said, huge innovations in climate finance at the moment. And the National Infrastructure Bank, which is being set up in Leeds at the moment, could be a key facilitator of that. I have to say that it will have, I think, a third the budget that we used to get from European investment funds, European EIB funding, structural funding. And so, you know, we couldn't rely on it too much. The government needs to be put under pressure to, you know, deliver on the net zero commitment, which is a key part of the UK Infrastructure Bank, and to scale it up, I think. And the work we're doing through PCAN hopefully will impact on that in the years to come. A last point, just quickly, and then I'll finish, is that a just transition isn't only about the outcomes and the impacts and the lived realities of all of this. It's very much about the processes and the need to build community involvement, and for people to feel that the transition is something that's being done by them and for them rather than to them, is absolutely crucial. And the commissions that we run through PCAN are a key part of trying to build the buy-in, give different communities a voice, and not just the same communities that we hear from regularly, but other communities which are too busy doing other things to think about climate change at times. And then to build that sense of legitimacy and a social license for the radical transformations that an effective response to climate change is going to demand. And if we don't do that, then I think we will be stopped in our tracks at some point. And, you know, even if you're only concerned about climate change and delivering that net zero transition, then, you know, that's a problem in itself. But surely we should be concerned with the social and economic dimensions of this as well, and not only with the climate itself. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andy. Before I introduce our last speaker, Linda, I just want to say that people have started posting questions in the Q&A, which is great. You can start doing that. If you have a speaker you're directing the question to, you can specify that, and please give your name and affiliation, and feel free to upvote. It's very helpful if you upvote also questions you think are really relevant and should definitely be asked. So our last speaker is Linda Clarke, who's Professor of European Industrial Relations in the Westminster Business School. And Linda is also co-director of the Center for the Study of the Production of the Built Environment. She has expertise in the history of labor relations, vocational education and training, and in labor and climate transition, in particular as it relates to the construction sector, which is why I invited her to, so that we can get that sectoral diversity in perspectives. Linda, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, and thank you for asking me. I've got a PowerPoint presentation, so I'm going to share my screen, And hopefully you can tell me that that's come up. Yes? So I'm going to start. I'm going to really focus much more on social issues and also on construction, which after all is a sector that's set to have a massive increase in employment. So it's not in the same sense a fossil fuels sector. But I was going to start off by saying something about just transition and how we understand it. Of course, it's a concept that originated in the trade union movement, particularly in Canada and the US originally, but it's very interpreted very, very differently. And basically, I think we can put the interpretations into three categories. One, a market-based, which is about carbon pricing, assumptions that everything's going to be met by increased demand, and labour very much treated as a commodity. Then the second one is classed as ecological modernisation, where the focus is largely on things like retraining, proactive investment, and where labour plays a greater role, but rather restricted. And then radical transformation, which is about integrated and regulated energy supply, higher qualifications, a broader occupational profiles, and where labour is an active agent. And I hope I persuade you by the end of this short talk that for construction, the latter is really rather necessary. Construction is responsible for 40% of CO2 end use emissions. And really to really combat this, we need energy efficient targets through airtight building envelopes, on-site renewables, to leading to nearly zero or zero energy building. Now, one big problem of this, and which I'm going to also refer to quite a bit, is the performance gap, which is the gap between what is the intention, the design intention, and what is actually achieved in buildings. And I've shown this little diagram here of heat pump installations where it shows just the real problem of actually achieving these targets that are set, in particular because of the training of the workforce. And I think this probably applies for all sectors, but it's particularly severe in the construction sector, where there needs to be a massive program of training and retraining. There was a big EU exercise across 30 European countries, which showed clearly the weaknesses of vocational education systems, the need for interdisciplinarity, for coordination between different areas, occupational areas, and for a holistic understanding of building as an integrated system. These diagrams give you some idea of where heat losses go. And this is just to illustrate the point about interdisciplinarity, because really the loss is largely between the different occupations, whether that's the bricklayer or the roofer or the ground worker, where they each need to know what the other's doing. And the trouble with construction, of course, is it has these factional silos, professional and trade, and a very fragmented labour process. Lots of contractual divisions, labour-only subcontracting, agency labour, and that makes it even more difficult to overcome these sectoral divisions and to have integrated team working, which is what's really needed. I'll go on to the next slide. So we have a real problem in the construction sector in Britain. I mean, problem everywhere, but it's particularly severe here, I feel. Half the workforce is self-employed. 95 to 98% of firms are small or micro. And this means, and particularly with the massive use of agency labour, that there really isn't a training infrastructure. There's been a dramatic decline in training and apprenticeships, which is put down to a problem of employer disengagement. And there are currently enormous skill shortages. And the industry has come to rely on a migrant workforce. We know that many are disappearing. So there's a real recruitment crisis. And of course, it's a very exclusive industry. The workforce is aging. There are few young people coming in. And the industry has really excluded women for many, many years. Only 10% of managers and professionals, 24% of technical occupations, which is good because these are the areas which are set to increase, and 3% of skilled trade occupations. At the same time, often poor employment and working conditions. So what do we need? I mean, we've done now lots of research across Europe on what is really needed for low energy construction. It needs a much more qualified workforce, greater knowledge, more competencies, and know-how, a comprehensive high standard vocational system of vocational education with climate and thermal literacy embedded in qualifications and with the workforce able to manage different processes. Broad occupational profiles, not the rather narrow trade-based skills we currently have, so that workers can carry out a range of operations and develop transversal abilities. To break down this gulf between professionals and operatives, to have integrated team working where you regulate the subcontract chain, and above all direct employment, and to involve labour, and particularly trade unions, at the same time as being inclusive, involving women and ethnic minority groups. So I'm going to finish just with two examples where we can begin to see that this can be accomplished at local level, although it's a tall order. And of course it needs, as has been said, government support at the same time. Now this is an example from Wakefield in Yorkshire, which is a few years ago this was built, but it's to very high energy standards, even above passive house. Using green technologies, direct labour of all the workforce and all trades working together, plus a very large training scheme, which was on one part of the site with about 40 trainees trained also in collaboration with Leeds College of Building. And trade union involvement. But perhaps even more persuasive is the example of Glasgow City Building, which is owned by Glasgow City Council, but it's a combination of the local authority, a housing association, the Weekly Housing Association, and the Joint Trade Union Council. It employs 2,200 construction workers directly, and at the same time seeks to regulate the subcontract chain. It has a manufacturing arm, which employs 60% of those employed have disabilities. It's highly unionized. It has a very large inclusive training provision and workshops for low energy construction, and it involves women and ethnic minorities. I'm showing in some of these pictures, they've developed something called the Glasgow House, but of course as City Building specializes in social housing, and this has a 2/3 energy cost reduction, uses green technologies, locally sourced materials, high level insulation, air tightness, and efficient heating. And on the right, you can see one example, which is an estate of 350 units, which is the energy is provided now by heat pumps, a big heat pump unit. And plus they repair and maintain all of Glasgow city building stock. So really, if we look at the underlying dynamics of this example, which could provide some kind of model for local authorities in particular, it's a long established direct labour organisation, has historically strong union involvement, is not for profit, so has a distinct social ethos, and has Scottish government involvement at the same time. So just to finish there on my last slide, I say that the conclusions from our research is that we shouldn't just be talking about job creation and green jobs, but see this as a wonderful opportunity in many respects to transform and improve employment and working conditions in construction. It's not just about skills development, but also about knowledge and competencies and upgrading vocational education and training programs, about energy literacy for the entire workforce if we're going to meet energy targets and overcome the performance gap, a need for much greater involvement of the workforce and of trade unions, greater team working, and to break down these hierarchies that exist, particularly in construction, and the need for inclusivity, recruiting those excluded if we're going to achieve wide-scale, zero-energy, new build and retrofit programs. So that's my presentation. Thank you. I'll stop screen sharing.
Great, thank you, Linda. That was very interesting. So we will start maybe with I'll take my prerogative as a chair to ask a few questions. And I'm seeing a lot of questions coming through the Q&A, and so that's very delightful. And so please keep voting up and giving your questions. We will turn to them very, very shortly. So I wanted to ask a question about public opinion and perception about the transition and the justice aspects of the transition in different constituencies that you have experience with. Both sort of, what's the level of awareness? Charlotte started alluding to that, but it would be really great to hear more of different constituencies, you know, going from the union to workers to residents who are maybe in more vulnerable catchments. What is the awareness of kind of the scale of change, the threats and opportunities, and also some of the initiatives that are underway, and what can be done to improve the link between, you know, this sort of discussion, what's going on within policymaking, what's going on within these climate commissions, and the broader understanding by the public. So I was thinking maybe could each, given that you each have different experiences with different publics, give a short appraisal of that. Maybe Charlotte, would you like to start?
Yeah, great question. So my experience in the youth work that I'm involved with is that people are quite woke to the transition to net zero. Similarly with the industry that I'm a part of for the most part, although I would say that my opinion is quite biased in that because I work in energy and not using hydrocarbons is a huge part of the transition to net zero. So in those two kind of circles I run in, I guess, I would say that people are very aware of, those communities are aware of just transition. As a more general comment from kind of Scotland-wide comment from the Just Transition Commission, tells quite a different story, that people are not particularly aware of the just transition, and that language such as just transition and net zero is not particularly well known, and there does need to be a big public awareness campaign. You know, and I think what I think we need is a public awareness campaign that is akin to what we've seen with COVID, where the messaging around the kind of risks associated with coronavirus and the measures which are in place to keep people safe are so well known and widespread. There's been a really ambitious and targeted campaign to inform as many of the public about it as possible. And I think that is what we need on, yes, on just transition, but actually more importantly on climate change.
Great, thanks. Andy, would you like to take this one as well? Andy Gouldson, sorry.
Yeah, of course. I think that the level of awareness amongst senior decision makers and policy makers at the local and regional scales is much higher now than it was even 2 or 3 years ago. And the wave of climate emergency declarations that went through UK local government just before COVID was really, I think, unprecedented and really has led to quite a significant increase in levels of awareness. You know, whether the awareness then translates into commitment to delivery is another thing, because I think all those local authorities are now becoming more and more acutely aware that it was easy to sign up to an ambitious target and is much, much harder to deliver on it. That said, I don't think everybody is on board at a senior level for the reasons I said earlier. I think that some people some people view it as, well, start that sentence again. I think us climate folk can become a little bit tunnel visioned and think that it's the only game in town, and it's not. You know, we, I think, are acutely aware that it's an emergency and that we need to be transformative and do it all in the next 10 years. And absolutely, completely get that. But I don't think we've won over everybody in that conversation yet. And, you know, some people for very good reasons. We had a very contentious decision around Leeds Bradford airport expansion a few months ago, which really did reveal where, you know, in economics speak, you know, expressed preferences are different from revealed preferences. And, you know, what people say is not exactly what they do sometimes. And I think that conversation really did tease out a difference with some people saying, you know what, jobs are really important. We have, you know, a recession and many communities at risk. And, you know, other people for perfectly defendable reasons prioritize jobs over climate. And, you know, maybe we can say that's short-termist, but that is the reality that they're working in. And I think we need to understand it rather than dismiss it. And then lastly, just sum up, sorry, without rabbiting on too much, I think that, you know, the kind of greeny lefty progressives amongst us have this conversation amongst ourselves all the time. And that's good. And we need to energize ourselves and support ourselves and all of that stuff. However, you know, some of the communities that are not involved in that communication or that conversation are repeatedly not involved. And in Leeds, we ran a citizens jury 18 months ago now to facilitate proactively the bringing in of other voices into that conversation. And it was one of the best things we've ever done. It was very time consuming and so on, but it was massively energizing and hopefully really did build that social license for change because it involved everyone in the conversation. And I think unless we do a lot more of that, we're going to have problems, as I've said.
Linda, maybe from the point of view of construction workers' unions, what's the level of awareness of the problem and how to engage further?
Well, I mean, there's a growing awareness. Of course, there's a great awareness amongst, for instance, architects. But amongst the workforce, it's not particularly, well, I wouldn't say there's particular awareness. I mean, it's growing, as Andy said. And I think the other thing is that with the whole declaration of climate emergencies, well, I'm in London, across London, and also the kind of mushrooming of environmental groups just everywhere, it means that the local authorities can't act on their own. They have to work with these groups and with trade unions, and they realize that, and it has to be, as Andy said, a process of co-production, really. But if you go on site, you'll think, oh my goodness, what's going on here? Because we still see diesel vehicles. We've got, of course, carbon intensive concrete everywhere. It's an absolute disaster area. And you think, how are we ever going to cope with this? But I think the main problem that is really almost made invisible is this, as I said, the whole problem of vocational education, because we don't have the people to do it. And it is not going to come out of nowhere. And there's been, in this country, there's such a horrible overemphasis on higher education and a starving of further education that until we really think about coordinated, comprehensive vocational education systems, I really don't see how we can tackle this problem. Thank you.
Great. So I will right away turn to Q&A and maybe interject a couple questions along the way from my list. So our top question goes to Andy Pike here, where sort of everybody seems to really applaud the idea that we need more place-based, not necessarily more, but just like a place-based approach and spatial targeting of investments. But you know, how can this be implemented? What are the biggest opportunities here? What's the biggest number one change we could do to the institutional framework to get this at a bigger scale and upscale these innovations you were talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Marion, and thanks, Julie, as well. Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the $64,000 question in England in particular, given that it has a rather different set of powers and resources than the devolved territories, Scotland, for example, as we've heard from Charlotte. I mean, certainly there's a very positive kind of move, I suppose, towards understanding the geographical dimensions of these challenges and therefore trying to develop more place-sensitive, place-based approaches to trying to do this, rather than expecting that the national central state can just pull a lever in a kind of old-fashioned command and control fashion, and just transition will roll out across the national territory. Clearly is an important challenge to that. The problem with implementation, I think, in the English context is we have a very highly centralized system and this kind of patchwork of powers and resources. So the appropriate kind of tools aren't there, and the resources aren't there necessarily to enable local actors then to try and pull together their institutional arrangements and their mix of policies to address and tailor them to local circumstances to sort of push just transition forward. And this has been a kind of a chronic problem over many decades, but in a way it's almost got worse now. There's been an increasing level of centralisation now in the kind of post-Brexit, in the midst of the pandemic, where we've got the emergence, as I was describing earlier, then of these very nationally determined, nationally agreed, fragmented kind of pots of money that are really spatially targeted, Towns Fund, for example, and they're very top down rather than being place-based and more bottom up, that kind of brings together nationally supported frameworks with appropriately decentralized powers and resources. And I think that's where the big challenge and issue is for change in the English context. And, we've had this white paper promised for some time now, was going to be around economic recovery and devolution. Apparently now is going to be a levelling up white paper, which we're expecting later in the year around the spending review. So whether and how that will kind of make some movement towards the appropriate decentralisation of powers and resources, we'll have to wait and see.
Excellent. So we have a question for Linda that's fairly specific about SMEs in construction. This is from Kate Smith, Flood Innovation Center, Energy and Environment Institute, University of Hull, who says that you've highlighted all the issues that our partner SMEs have told us about in our project delivery. One big problem is that councils are tied to procurement contracts that favor large multinational firms who have the financial heft to put resources into the low carbon transition. Where councils are more conservative, at what point do you think we could break into the procurement process to give SMEs a business-led reason for becoming more progressive?
Well, that's really critical, the procurement process. I completely agree. And the local authorities, of course, do have powers through Section 106 clauses in particular to stipulate what kind of energy standards should be implemented, and also the number of women and the training requirements. So I think that particularly Section 106s are quite critical in terms of planning and giving planning permission to developments, and that the local authorities should be using those as, with as many conditions as possible in that respect, so that we can achieve these targets. Does that answer? I don't know whether it does.
Well, we're not able to have the attendees go into a full-on conversation, but if I mean, the subject of this is an important policy instrument, procurement, and surely that's kind of, you have to open every box of governance and see how to improve the coordination across all these objectives and build the capacity at that scale to do that, which is, a big job, but doable. And so we have here, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We have a cluster of questions that are going a little bit at sort of deeper macro social structural constraint around just transition. So you will understand what I mean when I give them. These are from Reinhard Huss, who is a retired researcher in the health sector, and who asks a question such as, do we need to consider universal basic income to ensure a just transition? For example, recognizing that you might invest in some industries, try to attract them, and new technologies, there's a lot of uncertainty, those might fail. And then the workers have invested in that. Where's the insurance on their part? That's my reading. But then we have, do we need more democratization of corporations in order to have any hope of getting the investment at the appropriate scale and skills and human resources and the right holistic approach. Or in the case of carbon capture and storage, if we don't are much more serious about avoiding socializing the risks of, say, from leakage and from all the liabilities that might happen from a technical risk point of view, we might reproduce the pattern of private rents and social risks from new technologies. So there's a very broad ranging, but in other words, sort of some institutional reforms that may be key to unlocking all the other things we want to see. Maybe I'll give this to Andy Gouldson first, take a stab at this.
Thank you. Actually, I'd love to hear Andy Pike's view on the universal basic income point, but just in advance of passing it on to him, I think that there's a huge opportunity for a mutualization of this agenda at the local level, and that mutual agenda could involve local investment in local projects. So Andy at the beginning mentioned green bonds, and there's a lot of innovation happening in that space at the moment, whereby local people could, a local authority can issue a bond, which for a period is only open to local residents, who would then have an opportunity to invest in a risk-free scheme because it's underwritten by the local authority to decarbonize, which would also generate jobs and produce cleaner air and so on and so on. And people get really excited about that idea. In Leeds is a city of nearly 800,000 people. The research says that those residents have, or collectively, £2 billion sat in their ISA accounts, their tax-free savings accounts. If we could mobilize 10% of that to invest in a retrofit scheme, and then we could leverage in other investment around that, and the people of Leeds felt that they had invested in and benefited from the transition, I think that could be transformative in reigniting that kind of civic pride and that mutual connection. And there was a long history of that in the UK until 20, 30 years ago. So there's a kind of institutional memory that could be tapped into, and a lot of innovation going on in that space. And to me, that could be really, really exciting.
Yeah, Andy Pike, please also take this question. I think it would be really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on universal basic income, but I think it's very interesting. I think it speaks to Reinhard is making a point here, speaks to a much bigger kind of set of issues, I suppose, about welfare and the whole kind of idea of a social investment state, I suppose, is what has been described in some of the academic literature, where rather than kind of welfare measures being tied to dynamics and rationales around austerity, efficiency, effectiveness, and so forth, could they actually be used, given that we spend as a country an awful lot of money on welfare, towards a more economically, socially, environmentally kind of tuned set of policy provision? And so I think that's a big sort of national question, I suppose, about what your welfare state is about and what kinds of things could it do. I mean, certainly there seems to be internationally some sort of promising local experiments around universal basic income, which again, I'm not sure the extent to which those have been tied into the sort of contributions that people make when they're in receipt of universal basic income for economic, social and economic things locally, for example. So maybe those things have been tied together. But I think one of the problems, again, we've got certainly in the English context, is that welfare policy is national, it's centralized, it's run by Department for Work and Pensions, and they don't really do decentralization, I don't think, from my experience. So the whole question of how you might provide welfare reforms that can be connected into this more place-based approach, if you like, to try and address some of these challenges of locally just transition, I think, again, is very problematic in the English context because of that national centralization.
I'm going to give a few questions back to the issue of engagement with the public. We have several questions from, from Julie Ridley from the Climate Action. It's all over there are questions throughout, so I'm skimming for the exact affiliation. Climate Action Preston, who has questions to Charlotte about how is the youth engagement? Can you give more detail? You know, how do you do it? What's effective, and whether climate emergency centers are part of the answer to engaging more people. I think forget if it's Linda who said that when you have local groups, you know, that really pushes forward the conversation also at the local level, obviously. And another question has come about how the fact that just transition sounds too academic, and whether there's another way of talking about this that resonates more easily. Maybe let's start with Charlotte, and then we'll go to Linda.
Yeah, good question. So how are youth engaged in the process in Just Transition in Scotland? A few different ways. So 2050 Climate Group is a youth-run, youth-led, youth-empowered organisation. We have a leaders network of over 500 people. And the primary way that we engage young people into the Just Transition kind of process and discussion is by utilising our leaders network. So in my personal experience, the Scottish Government had approached 2050 Climate Group to particularly gain young people's perspectives on Just Transition which is how we ended up with a position on the commission. And we then used that to form, through our commission position, we then engaged with our young leaders in our leaders network on certain issues, and provided a consultation response into the commission. So that's quite a specific example of how we've engaged with the youth on Just Transition. More broadly in the organisation, our approach is really to empower, equip and enable young people to be equipped and empowered to actually go into their own spheres to drive change in the way that is best suited to their own specific sphere of influence. We don't encourage the kind of youth process at 2050 Climate Group is not to have an institutional approach or a kind of charity-wide approach, but to really try and empower all of the young people to go out into their respective circles and do that themselves. Other ways that we have engaged with youth, we've worked with Scottish Government and through 2050 Climate Group, who is particularly committed to Just Transition. We've engaged with partner organisations such as Young Scot, which works with people between the ages of 12 and 25, and through things like the Scottish Youth Parliament. So we've had a lot of different bodies to engage with, a lot of different channels to engage with young people on Just Transition issues, and then to feed that directly back in through the channels that we have. Ultimately, as 2050 Climate Group, we are most interested in having proportional representation in all of these different panels, whether that be government-led, organisational-led, private company, public, to have proportional representation at levels of decision-making, where in our case, we're really advocating for youth, but we are ultimately advocating for representatives from, all genders and like ethnic backgrounds and things like that. So to really have proportional representation in how we do all of this engagement and how all of these decisions relating to Just Transition are made.
Linda.
Yes, I'll add to this. I mean, first of all, this provocative remark about Just Transition, it didn't come from, I've already said that, it didn't come from the academia, it came from the trade union movement, and it is very strong within the trade union movement globally, European-wise, nationally and locally. And I think the emphasis really is on the just. It's not just on transition, and we shouldn't forget that really. But I was going to say something about engaging the youth. Well, I mean, in construction, there's a real problem because there's a structural problem. You've got very big firms who don't actually employ people except for professional and technical, and the workforce is subcontracted or agency labor or whatever. I've said this already. So that's very difficult to involve young people in. Now, there's a clear structural problem there, and that is being addressed. I mean, there is a big initiative at the moment to really try and insist on direct employment of the workforce, which of course will relate back to this whole question of basic income. I mean, ideally, we want a system where people are either in education or they're working. That would be the ideal, and they have a guarantee of some kind of income. But also, there's also campaigns about the inclusiveness. I mean, obviously the industry, because it's become so exclusive, not just of women, but of ethnic minority groups, the Black and Asian youth are really still continue to be excluded from this industry. So these structural problems are kind of critical to break down, and also to really work with these these national initiatives on inclusiveness and trying to make the industry more inclusive.
Great. I have here a question from Niranjan Janardhanan, who is professor in management at LSE. This is a question, I think, for Andy Gouldson and Charlotte. Curious to understand the role that new enterprise can play and is playing in your respective communities in creating new jobs and livelihoods, as opposed to, in other words, as opposed to the incumbents, to the big existing companies. What's the differential role of these two kinds of enterprise, new enterprise and old rooted enterprises? Andy Gouldson, would you like to discuss this in the context of Yorkshire?
Yeah, I don't have any numbers to hand on that, but so this is rather impressionistic. My sense is that there's been a lot of dynamism and the SMEs that have started up and then grown into larger firms. But there's also been a phase of consolidation in the last, perhaps 3 or 4 years, where many of the smaller firms have been kind of brought up and absorbed into larger firms, and that the larger firms are pretty good at allowing smaller firms sometimes to take the risk and be innovative and waiting to see whether they are viable and or transformative or a threat to the incumbents, and then kind of picking them off when they have emerged. Many of the bigger technologies, I think, have a minimum efficient scale. Perhaps in the renewable sector is a good example of that, which is sometimes a challenge to smaller producers. But I think the exception to this, and Linda would know much more about this than me, is in the supply chain and the delivery of retrofit, for example, where, as Linda was saying earlier, it's very much dominated by SMEs and even, by micro enterprises often. And my colleague Alice Owen does some great work on this, and the key role of those micro enterprises in delivering the transition is sometimes overlooked. And the culture and the capacities and the training arrangements and so on for those small firms, I think, is a big issue. One of the things that's really damaged confidence in that respect, a few years ago, we had the feed-in tariffs, which, a whole new industry of solar installers grew up around that. And, to some extent survived with renewable heat and looking at heat pumps rather than solar panels, for example. But the feed-in tariffs were pulled so bluntly that it really destroyed confidence. And then that has been further compounded recently by the Green Homes funding, which was also managed really badly. And the central government put the blame on the lack of a skills of the supply chain, but actually the supply chain wasn't there because government hasn't provided stable policy to create the climate for investment and skills development and so on that's needed. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed picture, I think, but that's all impressionistic, as I said. I'm not sure about the actual numbers.
Yeah, likewise. Numbers, not sure. Personal experience, I work for an SME that was recently acquired by a new enterprise to deliver, to be a company in this area. And we are partnered with some of the large incumbent dinosaurs that you refer to in your question. And I completely agree with Andy, it is a mixed bag. There are a number, I mean, the beauty with a new enterprise and an SME, and possibly it's, you know, all down to the people, the entrepreneurs who are leading these organizations, is their ability to be agile and to kind of ride out the waves of some kind of difficult times in certain industries, when some of the kind of larger incumbents go off and do something else which is more secure for, in terms of risk and kind of profit margins and returns to shareholders. Some of the challenge, the real opportunity is there. For some of these smaller companies, the goal is to be absorbed by a larger incumbent, which is absolutely fine if that's their choice. Our experience so far is that we have the challenge that was referred to in the discussion earlier around procurement, and the opportunities for SMEs in established procurement processes which prioritize larger, kind of more reputable organizations, but also in terms of licensing. So projects that we develop require major licenses and consents from the regulators, who naturally prefer the organizations which have bigger numbers on their balance sheets and have strong track records with you know, building and operating and decommissioning big pieces of equipment and infrastructure. So there is a real role, but there's also for SMEs and new enterprises to play. Like, we are certainly the company that I work for, like our USP is that we're one of these new enterprises which is thriving in this market, but the only way that we're able to thrive is in collaboration with the big existing incumbents, because that's the reality of the procurement systems and regulatory preferences, I guess, which are in place. And I think there's a real task to be done to review if for example, a UK government or a Scottish government or Welsh government, if their priority is really to focus on the local supply chain, then there's a contradiction between that national priority and actually how that is being delivered in practice, where the priorities are, because it's a real threat at the moment of how services and products are being procured, and the companies which are doing that, and the hoops that they need to jump to, or the criteria that they need to meet to be able to do that, because that is where SMEs and new enterprises are held back in the current system.
Great, thanks. I have a question here about redistribution and locality. So from Tim Brown-Holtz-Schweigt, a researcher at Tyndall, Manchester. Tim writes, many of the issues raised so far are big-scale challenges that hard-hit areas will need external funding, for example, from the National Infrastructure Bank, to address. What do panelists think about balance between funders on one hand and local institutions controlling how funds should be spent? So we see the current top-down model that Andy Peck has been talking about, where you have to competitively bid and prove that you meet all these targets and objectives that Whitehall decides matter. And so what are good examples of striking the balance between these things and having local capacity for funding and as well as local initiatives? So I think, Andy Pike, it would be great to have your view on this, and especially maybe pointing to concrete changes or examples that we can draw on here.
Yeah, thanks, Marion. It's a very good point, Tim. I mean, certainly, yeah, as part of devolved powers and resources, the idea of having greater fiscal space, as I think I was calling it there earlier, that local autonomy over funding and financing issues is obviously part of that picture. And when you look at the kind of situation amongst local authorities, for example, that they've obviously come through a decade of austerity with big kind of reductions in terms of the transfers from from central government. They're kind of constrained in terms of their own tax spaces around two property taxes, council tax and business rates, which have gone through their own kind of problems and issues. I mean, where they have some capacity still and some autonomy is around borrowing. You know, they can borrow relatively cheaply from the UK Public Works Loan Board, which is a sort of arm of the Treasury's debt management office, and also they can borrow quite cheaply from each other. And there's been a big growth in kind of interlocal authority lending and borrowing too. So the possibilities of building up longer term borrowing and capital for investments in this kind of space is there. I think the big issue, of course, is for local authorities then is making these kind of Treasury Green Book compliant business cases then for local public investments then that can contribute to locally just transition and what kind of assets and activities they can do locally. But clearly that local knowledge is very important in terms of determining what they might be, really. It's certainly not something that can be identified from a desk in Whitehall in London, I would say.
I might have a little follow on here. What do you think of the attempt at creating these decentralized partnerships, as they're often called, with, for example, city-region deals, which try to have that more integrated local perspective as well as a long-term agenda?
Yeah, I mean, these were, you know, this was quite an innovation in the kind of English and then UK context now, the idea of these kind of deals between national and groups of local authorities at the sort of city regional level. And also, you know, they became tripartite deals when they spread out to Scotland and Wales and then Northern Ireland. So these were certainly innovations, and, you know, in a way, in a positive reading, they kind of helped unlock propositions, you know, a lot of which had a kind of, at least a transition, perhaps not too great a just transition sort of flavour to some of these developments. They certainly started the first waves in England around 2011 or so. And I guess they, you know, in a positive sense, they helped to do some of that. There was often very uneven amounts of money that were and powers that were packaged up in these deals. They were negotiated settlements often between central and groupings of local authorities. And on the negative side, they were very uneven in terms of what they were able to afford these local groupings of local authorities with. So with Peter O'Brien and other researchers in iBuild, which was an infrastructure business model research centre that Andy was involved in, I think, for as well. Some years ago, we did some analysis looking across the city deals, and, you know, there were huge variations in per capita investment that were made available through these deals between central and local government. So, you know, again, a very sort of patchwork, uneven, you know, not quite enough powers, not quite enough resources to really move the dial on this kind of stuff, I think, locally, Marion, to be honest.
Yeah.
Can I add something about, I was just going to add about retrofit, which is a good example, really, of where you could have kind of very fruitful investment. But at the moment, again, it's very much focused on individual retrofit, for instance. That's very much the government approach, and that's been a complete disaster. You need much more joined up thinking between the government funding and the local authorities, and to do it on a large scale, because until we take whole estates and say, look, this is a fuel poverty estate, this is an ideal investment, we're going to save people lots of money on their bills if we retrofit, you know, this is a good investment. But that's the kind of approach that needs to be taken, but it needs to be large scale, not individual.
Linda, while you're on the mic, we have some questions about sort of how to break some of these gaps in training and certification of new green skills. So question from Stuart Boothman, Just Transition Wakefield, that the question is, you know, yes, vocational curriculum tends to be insufficient, not forward-looking enough, and colleges feel bound to current building regulations, not planning for future standards. So how do we change this? And does the Wakefield district housing provide a workable model? Can you give a bit more detail? And then we have some questions about sort of some of the self-perpetuating sort of coordination failures that might be going on, such as the absence of formal qualifications for installation skills, leads to an inability to form new firms, and the lack of certification, of course, like means that there's no incentive to create training programs for that, or to take the time to train. So sort of information asymmetries also with consumers not knowing whether they will get a good quality installation or not, therefore not having any demand for it. So these sorts of like systemic issues around information, around skills and quality in construction. So yeah, basically, how do we change vocational education to be a bit more forward-looking? And are there somewhat easy fixes to really get sort of the incentives, for lack of a better word, to invest in these skills?
I could go on all night about this.
I'm sure. And we have only 5 more minutes, so.
To educate the public, to know that insulation is a highly skilled occupation. In Canada, they take 4 years to become insulators. In Germany, it's 3.5. You know, and construction is not an easy occupation. And the occupations need a minimum of 3 years training. Each occupation, it's not going to be done in 10 minutes or in a short course. Of course, for the existing workforce, you're going to need some kind of continuing vocational education. And there are possibilities. They've just set up a new centre in Wexford in Ireland, for instance, for low energy construction training. But I wanted to just say that the thing about training is it's become more and more not on site, although the government seems to believe that it's all by learning, by doing, and that it doesn't work, I'm afraid. It's become more and more workshop based and classroom based, because it's become much more knowledge based than, I mean, many countries in Europe, the large proportion of the training doesn't take place on site at all. And I think so this is really educating both the government and the general public to see that this is a highly skilled area, and we need to really respect the workforce and their capabilities.
Great. And on vocational education, whether, for example, the Wakefield project gives a model for how they can start being engaged in developing more forward-looking curricula.
Well, I think it was a very good model in the sense they set aside part of the site. I mean, the problem with training the workforce on site is that the small builders or self-employed don't want people getting in the way. They haven't got the time. And so to set aside part of a project just for training purposes, particularly if it's low energy, because this is new for everybody. So that, and particularly for those who've had no experience of it, it's going to take a long time. So it is ideal for me, and plus working closely with the colleges, and the colleges themselves being very well equipped with the necessary equipment. So that for me is the answer.
Great. So we're approaching the end, and so as a sort of last word, we've talked about the far-ranging changes that are needed, that are institutional, political, economic, and we have a long list, a wish list. But recognizing the path dependence of these processes, and that you have to start now. What are sort of big opportunities in the immediate, concrete opportunities that you see that governments at any level, whether devolved nations or local governments or the UK central government, have right now to make sure that we're moving the dial in the right direction? So you don't all have to answer. If anybody wants to jump in and answer something about a concrete, immediate opportunity. Okay, so Andy Gouldson and then Andy Pegg.
I think that there are several big things that can happen. One is, especially in England, and it's less relevant, but probably some relevance in the rest of the UK, the gap between local and national government is a big one. And I think that the absence of regional government and devolved powers is a major barrier. But I think even more than that, the culture that some people in central government have towards local government, especially local government that's been hollowed out by austerity, is really not helpful. And we need a much more positive relationship between local and national government to enable that. But another element of that is that I think that many of us still rely and depend on local government to do things which, frankly, they can't do in the old way of a state-centered provider of a transition or a controller of different elements of the transition, and a culture change in local government, which has happened in many places, but not all, to facilitate partnership working and to share responsibility and focus on collective action involving all the actors across a locality, I think is key. And then the last big one, I think, is around that localization of finance and investment. I think that there are all sorts of forms of finance that can be mobilized to deliver a just transition. But I think that they've yet to be unlocked and facilitated. And actually, I think national government in the UK has yet to be convinced that place-based investment is a good way forward. I think they prefer often monolithic and not very entrepreneurial ways of doing things, despite the rhetoric of government. So yeah, some culture change to facilitate local, inclusive, place-based approaches. Someone made a comment in the questions as well, which is a really good one about, would that lead to an unequal landscape? And yes, it could. I think there has to be some combination of leveling up as well as a localization to go along with it. And yeah, that's a key element of the transition too.
Andy Pike.
Yeah, I mean, really echoes Andy's points, really. I mean, I think that it is the potential for this kind of innovation around funding and financing mechanisms, because we keep hearing from the investment community that there's a wall of capital out there. It's just about finding the appropriate investment opportunities to invest it in it, because they want returns, they want risk, they want a balanced portfolios, and so on and so forth. So I think that's where the work can potentially move forward, in terms of trying to recognize that in an environment of relatively low interest rates, relatively low returns, that the kinds of locally just transition oriented investments may become relatively more attractive if they're packaged up in appropriate ways and at appropriate scale to get these kind of investors involved. But it sometimes needs some kind of lead, if you like, from national, in concert with local government, to try and create the kind of confidence and sometimes the guarantees that are necessary to kind of create these kind of new mechanisms, if you like, for funding and financing to kind of push this locally just transition forward. So I think that's where you could really see a focus for activity into the future.
Great. Well, Linda?
Well, I just wanted to say, I mean, from the point of view of construction, the opportunities I see are the fact that this is really a very exciting industry, and it's always ready to confront change and the need for change. And that's what makes it even more interesting. But also to say that besides just construction, there's the awareness everywhere of the need to fight climate change, and the urgency of the whole issue is really opens up enormous opportunities, in my view.
Well, actually, that's a perfect conclusion. And so I would like to thank everybody who's joined this event for your participation. It's been a very lively chat. I've been very challenged to actually keep up with it. So thank you for your engagement. And of course, thank you very much to the four of you, Charlotte, Linda, Andy, and Andy. Yes, I think that there are going to be more of these events on this topic, because it's absolutely urgent and complex, as you have recognized from today's conversation. So thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.